Hello everyone, welcome to Interface 4. I'm Vahid Aryadus from the National Institute of Education of Nanyang Technological University. Today's topic is about research waste. What is research waste in applied linguistics research, origins in and parallels from healthcare research, and how to reduce it. We have two great presenters today, Dr. Talia Isaacs and Dr. Hamish Chalmers. Talia is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics and TESOL and Departmental Inclusion Lead at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, University College London. She has varied interests in applied linguistics, but is most known for her research and work in the broad area of language assessment, second language speaking, and health communication. She has instructed courses in these areas in the UK, the US, and Canada, and is a seasoned research supervisor with recognition from the UK Council for Graduate Education. Talia is, as you know, the co-editor of the international journal Language Testing, championing open science principles to improve accessibility and transparency in research administration. Alongside her language-focused activities, she brings applied linguistics expertise to the clinical trials research community. Very welcome, Talia, to Interface 4. And our second presenter who co-presents the seminar with Talia is Dr. Hamish Chalmers, who is a lecturer in applied linguistics and second language acquisition at the University of Oxford, a former primary school teacher in UK state schools and international schools overseas. His primary research interests center on evaluations of pedagogical approaches to teaching children who use English as an additional language. His methodological interests include randomized trials, systematic reviews, and user engagement in research. He is co-director of the University of Oxford Education Deanery, an organization dedicated to empowering educators worldwide to understand, use, and co-produce high-quality research evidence in education, and also the editor of the International Database of Education Systematic Reviews. As you know, Interface is a platform to provide a dynamic platform for the exploration of pioneering research across language and diverse scientific disciplines. Today, it's my great pleasure to host these two wonderful researchers and my colleagues. Without any further ado, I would like to pass the time to you, Talia and Hamish. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahid. I mean, it's a huge pleasure and honor to be here and, to get to talk about a subject that we hold dear, which is how to avoid research waste in applied linguistics. Some is avoidable, some less in researchers' control, and we'll try to unpack all of that, drawing on perspectives from where that concept originated, which is healthcare research, and then extrapolating that and talking about applied linguistics research. But again, a great pleasure to be here speaking as part of the Interface series. So just a bit of background, just before we actually get on to this, we've got, this concept of waste. And obviously here we're going to be talking about research waste, but applied linguists and I think in the public arena in general have increasingly been talking about the environment and sustainability, drawing on ecological perspectives. That's the case with applied linguists as well. We've heard talks at the American Association of Applied Linguistics meeting this year on ecolinguistics, eco-critical awareness, and sustainability. So here, obviously, we're talking about research waste. So this is an attempt to sort of think as applied linguists about what we can learn from another field as a way of maximizing the potential benefits of research and avoiding waste that is avoidable. So we were inspired by the work of Ian Chalmers and Paul Glazhew in the field of healthcare research. And so they published initially a 2009 article in The Lancet, which has one of the highest impact factors of all medical journals. So highly influential journal, very high impact paper. So it's already got nearly 2,500 citations for that paper alone, and a bunch of papers based on this construct of research waste followed in healthcare research. So they effectively presented a taxonomy of waste sources in the research production and dissemination process, which some of which are avoidable. And they felt that if those were adequately addressed and acknowledged, that they could actually improve healthcare research. Now, the innovation of the talk that we're presenting today is to effectively bring Chalmers and Glasgow and the sort of subsequent articles' perspectives to the attention of applied linguists and learn about what might apply to our field as well, what lessons we can learn and how we can move forward with it. So research waste, I've written here as a concept that has legs. We think that it's a really catchy concept, and it's one that you'll see has had impact in different fields already. So in sort of evidence-based medicine community, there is now an award annually for initiatives like research initiatives and other initiatives that have the potential to reduce research waste. So this has become a concept that it's really been anchored in the healthcare community. It's part of kind of their mentality, and there is a lot that they sort of take for granted in terms of avoiding research waste that, to me as an applied linguist, was kind of a novel concept. So I felt very privileged to be immersed in sort of discussions with colleagues, through my involvement in the clinical trials methodology community, where discussions of research waste are quite routine. So again, here we're bringing this to light. And then the ecologists actually took up this concept of research waste. So this has also been featured in ecology, including attempts to actually quantify research waste. For example, in terms of the proportion of research in ecology or in healthcare research that is wasteful, where the outcomes can't be used, and then equating that to, a US dollar figure of waste, because we know that some of this research can be really expensive. And then Hamish and I, of course, have published this article in Language Teaching fairly recently, trying to bring this to applied linguists. But I'd note that this was 15 years after the initial publication of that seminal Chalmers and Glasgow article. So, there's an attempt now from an interdisciplinary group of researchers to develop a taxonomy of research waste and to try to understand what is specific to the field, individual fields, and what might be more universal across fields. Over to you, Hamish.
Thank you. Okay, it's probably worth me just clarifying that the Chalmers in the Chalmers and Glasgow paper is not me. That's another Chalmers, but someone who I know very well, and have been steeped in the ideas of efficient research and non-wasteful research in healthcare, but also the principles of that also apply to any kind of research. So I'm just going to spend some time on this slide just describing a little bit more about what we mean by research waste and why we should focus on it. First of all, we believe that research ought to be efficient. It should answer questions that are important to the research community and the practice community, and it should do so in a way that doesn't waste our resources or our time or our sort of intellectual capacity as far as possible. So perhaps the most obvious way to look at this is the fact that we are all either directly or indirectly funders of research. Through our tax pounds or dollars or ringgit or wherever you're from, you are indirectly or directly funding research, and research is done in the public interest. So, for example, in the UK, we have the UK Research Institute, which uses public money through taxation to fund research. And so therefore, there's a moral, if not legal, responsibility on the part of researchers to make good use of that money. And we know how, when we're putting together grant applications, there's lots that needs to be done with it, from the time that it takes for an academic to put together a research proposal to the costs associated with conducting research, and then the costs associated with disseminating and sharing that research. So it's important, we believe it's important that we use that money wisely. It also can be Talia's driving the PowerPoint deck, so thanks, Talia. If we move on, yes, if we can move on to the next slide. So the taxonomy that was originally proposed by Chalmers and Glasgow and then expanded on by MacLeod and colleagues in 2014 put research waste into 5 categories. each of which can contribute to doing things that we can that are wasteful that we can avoid. So this is the taxonomy that we adapted from the healthcare version, which is very similar, but I'll just briefly go through it, and we will talk about each of these areas in a little more depth after I've gone through this. The first potential source of wasteful research relates to the relevance of the research questions. So are research questions relevant to the stakeholder interests and concerns is the first point in that. So are we asking questions that anybody aside from ourselves as individual researchers have any interest in? Research ought to address questions which are of immediate practical value to the stakeholders. And so that in our context might be teaching approaches. It might be finding out about the context in which we learn or which we teach. Also, the outcome measures, are they meaningful for stakeholders? So are we actually doing research which looks at things that people want to know about? The second potential source of research waste is the necessity of the research and the appropriateness of the design. So when we talk about that, we'll look at whether research actually does contribute to our body of knowledge. Are we doing research which is necessary in terms of, is there a question that needs still to be answered, or do we have a decent understanding of that question already, and therefore we can use our resources elsewhere to answer questions which haven't been addressed? And then associated with that is the research design. Is research designed in such a way that it is capable of answering questions? And so we can see that sometimes there's what some describe as a sort of a paradigmatic war between, the qualitativists and the quantitativists. But of course, certain types of research are well suited to answering certain types of question, and less well suited for other kinds of questions. So we need, as researchers, to be clear that we are addressing a question in a way which is robust and appropriate. The third potential source of research waste is associated with research regulation and management, and that's to do with the bureaucratic processes that happen before research has been conducted, during the process of research, and then associated afterwards with publication and dissemination, which leads us nicely onto the fourth potential source of research waste, and that of course is about publication and dissemination. If we have done research and we don't publish it, that is considered to be wasteful, because we should be, whether we've got null results or contra-orthodox results or results that conform to the orthodoxy, nonetheless, everything should be published, because we're again going back to the idea that somebody has participated in the research and the understanding that they will be contributing to knowledge, and money has been spent on this. So we do need to report it. And then are the findings of research disseminated in ways which stakeholders find appropriate, and they can actually contribute to the advancement of the practitioner field? And then the final source of research waste is the quality of reporting. And that refers to whether research has been reported in such a way that it's understandable and that can be then applied appropriately. And we find sometimes that the quality of reporting leaves us wanting in that respect. Next slide, please, Talia. So this is going into a little bit more depth about the first question there. Are the research questions relevant to stakeholders' interests and concerns? And we refer to, in our paper, a study by, or a paper by Masatoshi Sato and Sean Lerwin called Do Teachers Care About Research? The Research Pedagogy Dialogue. And in that paper, they are quite upset about the idea that research has been done by researchers, and that it seems to answer questions that ought to be of relevance to teachers. But they said, Sato and Lowen say, that it doesn't seem to be picked up. The teachers, they potentially have the evidence that would inform their practice, but they're not acting on it. And so they say, well, this is an issue, and really we ought to be addressing this by finding ways that teachers and researchers can get into dialogue about the research, so that researchers can communicate the findings of their research appropriately, and therefore that can be used to influence what goes on in the classroom. And they recommend doing workshops and knowledge exchange activities so that teachers can come and find out about research, and that they can then use that to inform their practice. we take a slightly different view of this, although we completely agree with both of those two authors on the importance of teacher and researcher dialogue. But we feel that teachers and other practitioners ought to be right at the beginning of the research process. They should be there helping to set the research agenda so that researchers know from the off whether they're going to be doing something which is likely to be taken up by teachers. Next slide, please, Talia. So one of the ways that we can do this, and this is something that I've done with colleagues at the University of Oxford, is to have what we describe as priority setting partnerships. It's very similar to a Delphi method, which you may be familiar with, but that's basically bringing experts together to discuss a particular issue and come to a conclusion about that issue through dialogue. So I'm very briefly going to tell you about the setting research priorities for English as an additional language study that we did at Oxford. Like I say, as you know, because Vahid told you, I was a primary school teacher originally before I became a researcher. And it always struck me that some of the research that I was reading, assuming that I ever got to see research, and that's a whole different question, which we'll get to later on in the talk about whether teachers see the research that's supposed to inform their practice. But it was often there were questions that really I felt that weren't being addressed, things that I needed to know as a teacher. I was like, well, how do I teach vocabulary effectively? Is it worth my while giving lists of vocabulary items to learn as homework, or should I be doing something else in the classroom? Or any number of different questions. So when I became a researcher, one of the first things I wanted to do was find out from practitioners like I was what they felt were priorities. So we did this research priority setting partnership where we brought together stakeholders as stakeholders who were teachers or policymakers in English and additional language, and asked them, what are priorities for you? What unanswered questions do you have about your practice? What could we be doing with our time and the money that we get through grants to ask questions that are going to help you to basically to be more effective teachers? And so we used, this was using very much driven by stakeholders. So we had a steering committee, which was practitioners in the EAL field, and we asked, we had surveys to survey teachers in the field about what they wanted to be done. Now I have another paper on that I can tell you about later for the full information, but what this ended up with was a top 10 list of research priorities for EAL, which we then publicized to funders and have published and are now disseminating to teachers, so that researchers can, at that very beginning of the research process, be confident that they won't be wasting their time, money, effort, and resources, because they will be addressing questions for which there is a demonstrable interest among the people who their research is intended to inform. And that was rather successful, and we would like to promote the idea of addressing that first source of research waste by involving stakeholders right at the beginning in setting research agenda. Over to you, Talia.
Yes. So I want to now shift a little bit to the healthcare sort of funding enterprise. So the National Institute for Healthcare Research, or the NIHR in England, it is the largest national health funder in Europe. So they fund a lot of health intervention studies, really a major funder of clinical trials. And it's interesting, but they have effectively from top down involved patients who have lived experience of a particular disease type, for example, in actually making funding recommendations. So obviously, often they're involved on evaluation panels alongside both academics and clinicians. And so people with sort of expertise in sort of academic domain as well as clinical research. But patients kind of have an expertise of their own in that they've lived with that condition, and their views are valued in terms of trying to decide who gets funded. So their views are really embedded. They're involved in other ways, for example, on steering committees for funded projects to provide oversight of that. Patients' views are often regarded as being a prerequisite now for securing funding. So they're actually often explicitly built into applied into funding bids for applied research. So you will have some what is called a patient and public involvement and engagement representative. So they tend to be named on grant applications. Sometimes they're co-authors on publications, and they can help academics and clinicians who are running the research studies actually tailor that more for a lay audience. And sometimes they're involved in the co-production of research, so as actual co-investigators. Sometimes their involvement, I think, unfortunately, can be tokenistic, but I think in the vast majority of cases, there is really meaningful involvement of patients as one voice, one stakeholder voice, in actually shaping research. So I give a lot of credit to the NIHR for sort of prompting this change from top down by requiring researchers to do this when they apply for funding. So we'll now take an example of a sort of research study, again, in the domain of clinical trials, but it's really a pedagogically driven study. And the idea is to actually think about embedding stakeholders' views, and in this case, we're talking about the general public in the development of the study. So the general public were effectively consulted to come up with this study, and then I think it's a really interesting one. So it was done on social media, but the idea was to help members of the general public think critically about health claims, because we know that we're inundated with claims about sort of what works in terms of effective medicine. Pharma industry can issue ads about this, and we really need to be critical consumers about health claims, in the same way that teachers and learners need to be critical consumers of pedagogical materials and the claims that they may make. And so there are nice parallels here with sort of educational and applied linguistics research. The goal of this study was both to help people think critically about health claims, but also to enhance their understanding of randomized control trials in healthcare. So as I said, people were involved in every facet of the development of this clinical trial, from trial design decisions and development through to sort of actually defining the research questions. So members of the public could sort of come up with and brainstorm things that they were interested in investigating in terms of healthcare. And then sort of there was some consensus building, but also to think about what the intervention might be, or the treatment, and then the comparator, and then the actual outcomes, or what variables would be measured, like the dependent variables to test the effectiveness of the intervention. And I imagine that applying for ethics approval for this study must have been quite complicated, because actually the whole variables that would be looked at and research questions were not known at the outset of the study. This was something that required consultation with members of the general public. So let's look at what they ended up investigating. So they, the members of the public, selected to investigate whether pre-bed reading is beneficial, harmful, or shows no effect. So they wanted to compare. So they had two groups effectively. One group, and they randomly allocated research participants who were lay members of the public to one group or the other. So group one was reading a book in bed before going to sleep, and then group two was not reading a book in bed before going to sleep. They controlled for certain things, for example, caffeine intake, and using electronic devices in bed before a certain time. So they wanted to look at which of these were more effective, or whether there was no effect. And they found that 42%, so overall, the reading group reported improved sleep compared to just 28% in the comparator group. So that means that it seems that pre-bed reading is beneficial. So this is, again, just an example. We don't really care that much about the outcomes here, but of how the general public can be mobilized to co-produce research. I'm going to shift here to talking about the outcome measures, or the dependent variables, and whether they're relevant to stakeholders. So this was an example from, it was done in 1993, so a long way back here, but in a kind of domain of rheumatology, so looking at rheumatoid arthritis. And so the researchers here, and this was the American College of Rheumatology, so it was, I think their intention was to come up with a set of core outcome measures that count the most for sufferers of rheumatoid arthritis. So what would we use to measure whether a treatment has been effective or not, harmful potentially? To do this, they conducted a review of the literature, and then they actually evaluated the validity and reliability of the outcome measures that were reported in previous rheumatoid arthritis trials in order to derive this set of outcome measures. And that the intention was for this set of outcome measures to then be rolled out for all rheumatoid arthritis trials. And they came up with measures related to pain, physical function, degree of swelling and tenderness, but patients were not consulted in the first instance, and they actually missed a key symptom, which happened to be fatigue, which patients reported as being absolutely debilitating. And for many patients, that was their primary, the primary thing that made the disease very difficult to manage. And it wasn't even captured in these recommended outcome measures. So it just goes to show that there really is a need to consult stakeholders in the health domain, that may be patients. In, the educational domain, we might be talking about teachers, learners, parents, head teachers. I think thinking about different stakeholders is really important, and trying to feed their perspectives into all elements of the research process, from inception through to defining the outcome measures and then dissemination. So just to shift here to educational trials and think about those outcome measures, they tend to be quite restrictive in educational research. So the Educational Endowment Foundation funds a lot of educational intervention studies, but the outcome measures tend to be restrictive, mostly focusing on academic attainment, for example, through standardized tests, or the cost of that intervention, whether it's cost effective. But we think that this is too narrow in terms of focus, and other outcome measures could paint a more complete picture. For example, you could also have measures of stakeholders' anxiety levels, self-efficacy, motivation. So maybe just including test scores as the outcome measure implies that that's all that counts for stakeholders and all we value as a society. And I think that's fairly sad in the context of education. And certainly we think that should not be the only valid demonstration that an intervention works, that a broader range of measures that also count for stakeholders should be taken into account. But often they're not, for sort of reasons that the funder imposes. So that's that consideration. Is this me, Hamish?
It is, yes.
Yeah, okay. So we've now just gone through research waste category 1, which was to do with asking the wrong research questions. And we also talked about those outcome measures. And we're now going to shift to research waste category 2, which is failing to situate new research in the context of existing research. So to see whether all relevant published and unpublished evidence that is available has been considered before undertaking a new primary study or some kind of synthesis of the evidence. So again, here we'll shift to a healthcare example, and then we'll come and bring it back to applied linguistics. So let's look at this example. I mean, this was a book that was on my mother's bookshelf. It was Dr. Spock's bestseller. There were millions of copies sold. And this was during the time before Oprah. It was considered kind of the first cult book. In fact, in the US, there were more copies of this book sold than the Bible. So it was a real blockbuster and highly influential. And and written by a physician. So Dr. Spock was a doctor. Just trying to provide trusted advice to parents. So the initial version came out in 1946. And in that version of the book, there were many different editions. It was highly successful. But in the initial edition, Dr. Spock recommended that babies sleep on their backs. In the revised edition, 10 years later, he split that advice and switched to advising stomach sleeping. And he gave some fairly reasonable reasons against back sleeping, to do with vomiting and the baby being more likely to choke on it if they sleep on their back, and that also maybe that could flatten the baby's head. So these seem quite rational. But evidence started to come out. So there were some studies published, primary studies published in 65 and 1970, suggesting that tummy sleeping actually harmed babies. And then a whole host of studies that came out from 1986 onwards, further suggesting harm and no benefit. By 2005, so this was, I think, around 40 years before the, years before the initial primary study, the first meta-analysis was published on this, so trying to synthesize the existing evidence from primary studies, and they found a significant association between cot death, which obviously is a tragedy, and tummy sleeping compared to back sleeping. And they did that. You could actually see that there was a significant association just based on those two initial studies published in 1965 and 1970 when they pooled those analyses. Effectively, it took a while for Dr. Spock to actually get up to speed with this. He kept recommending tummy sleeping until later, and then other care books did so much later, until the late 80s. So we think that this is an example of advice that was intended to be well-meaning, but it was unsubstantiated. There was no good evidence supporting it. And when the evidence did come out, unfortunately, it wasn't synthesized early enough, resulting in a lot of cot deaths around the world that could have been prevented if the evidence had been synthesized earlier. Okay, Hamish.
No, thank you. So in applied linguistics research, thankfully, the stakes are slightly lower. We're not, it's rare that somebody dies as a result of not taking into account the evidence from applied linguistics research. But the principle of taking into account everything that's gone before feeds into the idea of doing research which is not wasteful. So the principle of we believe should be that before any new piece of research is conducted, a systematic review is either consulted, or if no relevant systematic review exists, then one should be done to see what we know already. And Talia gave a very sort of stark example of where this can be, where it can help us. We could have been in a position to make decisions that were would in the case of cot death would have been were very important, but it wasn't until the 80s that we caught up with the research that had gone before. But nonetheless, like I go back to the point that I made before, research is costly in terms of money, effort, resources, and intellectual capacity, as also in terms of opportunities. So if you're doing research for which we already know the answer, then you're wasting those precious resources, and you could be doing something better with your time. So a couple of examples now from applied linguistics. This is a meta-analysis looking at studies which had compared phonological awareness in L1 with phonological awareness in L2. And you can see this is from a systematic review by Melby-Lovag and Lovag in 2011. And for those unfamiliar with what a forest plot does, well, basically you've got a point estimate, which is the black squares, and then a confidence interval, which is the line that goes through those black squares for each of these studies. And then in the bottom right-hand side, you've got the cumulative point estimate for whether there is a correlation between these two concepts. The zero line in the middle is the line of no difference. So you can see that every single study falls onto the side of, yes, there is a correlation. And we can see that the only study where there may be some sort of uncertainty around whether that's a real correlation was done in 2000, one of the later studies, where the confidence interval crosses the line of no difference. Otherwise, we can be extremely sure that there are correlations between L1 phonological awareness and L2 phonological awareness. So the question here is that if anybody is considering doing any more research on this, maybe they ought to think again, because there's no reason to go back and relitigate this question. An answer is very clear. We do know that there are these correlations here, and so time, effort, money, and so on can be sort of directed elsewhere and be less wasteful. Next slide, please. Here's another example. I don't know if you're familiar with the British saying of "one swallow does not a summer make," and that's a sort of a warning in this terms, is we can't just base our practice decisions on one study. We do have to look at more than one study. We should be doing replications until we get to a point where we can be confident. But this is another example of where we believe that the research question has been settled and there's no need to do any more research on this. So this is, again, it's a forest plot that shows the results of a number of different studies that look at the relationship between foreign language enjoyment and foreign language anxiety. 46 studies are represented here, conducted over only 6 years. We can see down the bottom at the right there, one study finds a clear positive correlation. That is that the more you enjoy foreign language learning, the more anxious you are. It seemed quite counterintuitive, and then that's borne out by much of the rest of the information here. So one study that finds a positive correlation, but a negative correlation can't be ruled out. That's the one with the yellow border around it, where you see that the confidence interval crosses the line of no difference. 4 studies that find a negative correlation, but positive correlation can't be ruled out. So again, those are the ones with the green boxes around them. But 40 studies finding a clear negative correlation between foreign language anxiety and foreign language enjoyment. Now, we could ask, is it summer yet? We've got a huge number of studies here, all coming to, pretty much all of them coming to the same conclusion, and a fairly robust conclusion at that. So we would argue here that to do any more work on the relationship between foreign language enjoyment and foreign language anxiety would be wasteful research, and that the researchers could be better directing their resources on answering new questions. Certainly related questions. This helps us to then set a new research agenda, like maybe we could be looking at research which seeks to reduce foreign language anxiety and therefore increase foreign language enjoyment. But this is just underscoring the point of the waste source 2, in that we should take into account the totality of the evidence that exists before we embark on any new research, and use that to inform the direction of that new research. Thank you. Okay. So related to that, so firstly, has all the relevant existing evidence been considered? Is the research design suitable for addressing the questions? So if we move on to the next slide, please. We know as researchers that there are different types of research design that are differently suited to answering different questions. We need the right tool to the job for the job. And applied linguistics research covers a whole host of different types of research questions, addressing different types of outcomes. So we need to be sure that research designs are appropriate for those questions, and therefore they can maximize what they can tell us, and therefore be unwasteful. Now, as you know, I'm interested in systematic reviews, and an important part of systematic reviewing is to do a quality appraisal of the eligible studies that are part of that review. And in the research that I've done on this, it's very common to find poorly designed studies, or studies that have not taken into account the importance of research design and using robust design. So that may be something as simple as trying to answer a causal question using an observational design. And if we want to be confident about causality and therefore how to influence our teaching, we need to make sure that the right design is used. This is true of healthcare and applied linguistics research, and I assume pretty much many other areas of research as well. MacLeod found in 2014, for example, that half of health intervention studies did not take the necessary methodological measures to reduce bias that could mislead us. And again, in systematic reviews in applied linguistics, we found enormous variability in the appropriateness of research designs for addressing questions robustly. And there's a couple of reviews there that will that you can refer to see those risk of bias assessments. So this is something that we need to address in using the right design for the research. So we're now going on to research category 3, which is about inefficient research regulation and management. We won't spend too much time on this one because it's perhaps has the least evidence around it for us to talk to. But this is essentially some of the bureaucracy around the research process. The first one that I want to look at, next slide, please. It refers to bureaucratic overreach. And the processes of unduly burdensome in light of the risk, and that can stymie research progress and waste time and energy. We all know that we need to act ethically when we conduct research, but the ethical principles for different types of research are different. So to be held to a standard which would be appropriate, for example, for biomedical research, might not be the same for if you're just trying to find out what opinions and attitudes people have in the school. So another example is when in some of the institutions that I've had the pleasure to work with, there has been questions raised over the ethics of using a control group. Now, there's good reason in medical research to want to be very careful that if you're having a control group who does not get the promising new treatment, that there is safeguards in there to make sure that if the treatment the novel treatment that's being studied looks like it's more beneficial than the comparator, then you should be able to take steps to make sure that the control group aren't disadvantaged. But we think that the risk is much less so in education, and that therefore holding education researchers to the same standards as medical researchers, for example, with the use of control groups, might not be appropriate. In some cases it may be, in some cases it won't. But we find that can delay the process of getting research done and therefore informing the field. The next is bureaucratic inaction. And we use the example here of dealing with suspected academic misconduct with appropriate, consistent and robust processes. So we're using here an example of retraction. So retraction should be done quickly, it should be clear, it should be, and reasons for retractions of papers should be made. But here's an example of a journal which in 2010 published an article which was then retracted. On the journal website, you can see that note that just says the editorial board announced this article has been retracted very quickly, actually. But then if you have any further questions, please contact us. They say on the journal's website that the publisher is firmly committed to maintaining the highest level of integrity in the content that they publish, and they achieve this by adhering to the core practices established by COPE. And the 3 points of the COPE code of practice that are relevant to this are that there should be retraction should be linked to the retracted article. That allows researchers to go back and see what the problem was. They should state who is retracting the article, whether that's the authors or someone else, and they should state the reason for retraction. Now, none of these are here on this particular paper that we've highlighted, and so we can't recalibrate any interpretation of the evidence. We should be able to go back and say, remove data from a systematic review of meta-analysis, for example, and recalibrate our understanding of the world. If retractions aren't done timely and clearly, then we're not able to do that. Now, happily, there are people who do this properly, and this is quite an old article here. It's published in 2003, where retraction was done properly. You go to the journal website, you get the note of retraction. It's very clear. It's highlighted in red there. Retracted is printed across every page of the paper, but the paper is still there so that people can understand why it was retracted. And there's also a clear retraction statement that says that the article was retracted by one of the authors, and it was done so on the basis of unsound data. And this reduces research waste by allowing us, as I said, to recalibrate any global understanding we have of the particular theme by looking to see whether the retraction makes a difference in terms of what our overall understanding of the theme was.
So in this slide, we're going to jump to research waste category 4, and I think we're running out of time. So it's the question of, is the research reported at all? We know that academics are very busy, and often there is what we call a dissemination bottleneck, that sometimes, despite best intentions, academics don't manage to churn out the publications that they would like to. And so that results in a type of, I mean, it's unfortunate. I'm also culpable of this, and but it does result in a form of research waste. But one that is more systematic has to do with publication bias. You see here on this figure, this was looking at the fate of a number of social science experiments, that if you've got positive result where you show in quantitative research statistical significance, that you will tend to get your paper published in a good journal. Whereas if you have a null result, non-significance, researchers may not even write it up. And if they do, the chance of that getting into a really good journal is fairly small. So this means that the field is kind of distorted because the studies that show some effect for some kind of intervention, a pedagogical intervention or anything, would be overrepresented, and that kind of skews the overall picture, both in terms of interpreting sort of, and it's one individual study if researchers are cherry picking results and only reporting those that are statistically significant. And then when you go to synthesize the evidence, as Hamish was saying. And we find this also in an applied linguistics study, looking at bilingualism. So this was De Bruyner and her colleagues, looking at the claim of whether bilinguals have better executive functioning than monolinguals. And they found that indeed, 2/3 of studies that supported that claim based on works in progress that the authors had located were published, whereas those that had a null effect did not tend to see the light of day. Some journals in applied linguistics are now encouraging the submission of registered reports. So this is effectively a research plan or some blueprint before the actual data collection starts. It could be for primary or secondary study. And these journals, language testing, language learning, actually provide in principle acceptance to publish the full study if the authors follow the plan, and they can justify if there are minor deviations, but this is regardless of the results. So this kind of mitigates publication bias. If the research plan is robust, then we don't care if it's a null effect, we'll publish the full paper. So I think this helps editors and reviewers actually hold the authors to account by discouraging cherry picking or selective reporting, deciding what to report based on statistical significance, for example. So this is really important, particularly for confirmatory studies. On language testing, we'd like to see a greater uptick of people submitting registered reports. So I hope you'll consider that. Hamish.
Then one of the ways that we can do this is by prospectively publishing protocols, even if we're going to be presenting some work that's not going to be published in a journal which accepts registered reports. So it's good practice to produce a protocol for research that you're doing. The infrastructure is there, but it's a little bit fragmented. So we at the Department of Education established the International Database of Education Systematic Reviews, which on the one hand collects systematic reviews in applied linguistics. It's going to roll out to the whole of education at some point in the future, but currently it focuses on applied linguistics, but also a place to publish your protocol. And so there you can state that the method that's going to be adopted to conduct the systematic review, and this also acts as a good way of keeping reviews visible so they can't get lost to the file draw problem. And that when language testing is one of the journals that has now taken up the idea that people should preferentially publish their protocols prospectively, and that IDESA is one of the places they can do that. And so this is just to draw your attention to steps that we're taking to help to reduce research waste by allowing people a platform to publish their protocols, and therefore you can protect against the things that Talia's just said, like selective outcome reporting or cherry picking results, or changing a review focus halfway through because the results are not flattering or whatever. So we just wanted to highlight that to you.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you are doing a primary study in any area in applied linguistics that interfaces with education, it relates to the first category of research waste. Please go to IDESR and see whether there's been a systematic review on this before. And if there has been, make sure that you cite it. So it's really important that you're giving due credit to work that has come before when you propose a new study. Okay, so we're jumping to research waste category 4, talking about dissemination. We'll go through this fairly quickly. So it's looking at whether the dissemination of the study is communicated in an appropriate way, and also a way that is accessible to different stakeholders. So accessibility might mean conceptual accessibility, that it's not over the heads, that people can understand what it's about. It's not written in scientific language that stakeholders might not be able to understand. And then also physical accessibility, that it's not behind a paywall, that it's free to download. And there are some good examples of accessible content for a wider audience. For example, OASIS summaries in applied linguistics can now be done in different languages, as well as in sign language, actually. Some journals encourage video abstracts, again, to appeal to a wider audience, policy briefings. Here's just one example of good practice. It's the TESOL graphics project. Again, the aim here is to make secondary research, so systematic reviews, all types of evidence syntheses in applied linguistics, more accessible to teachers and other stakeholders. I think this was your study, Vahid, actually, on listening assessment. And this is just another example of, in the UK, the Education Endowment Foundation's approach to lay communication, looking at some kind of intervention designed for teachers to consult, excuse me. And so if you see here that there's feedback, that is something that is relatively cheap. There's good evidence for this. And there seems to be relatively good impact in terms of the additional months progress that you could make with the benefit of the intervention compared to not having had that intervention. We think that this is quite a nice way of displaying this, even though things like confidence intervals aren't strictly represented here. So you can see that for repeating a year of study is highly costly. There's pretty flimsy evidence on it, so there needs to be more evidence. But based on what we know, it seems to have a negative impact. So that might be something not to consider. Okay, over to you, Hamish.
Okay, so the final thing that we're going to talk about is the quality of the reporting. And you can have done the most fabulously designed study, which draws on the background of evidence that involves stakeholders in setting research questions, and which is done without bureaucratic inefficiencies. But if it's not reported well, then its use is compromised. And so, as a research synthesist, as someone who's done systematic reviews, it's incredibly frustrating to find reports that haven't been reported fully and transparently and systematically, so that you can actually understand what's been done. So this is the final category of where, with all the best intentions, we can slip up at the end and produce research which isn't as valuable as it ought to be. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to just tell you about some of the things that you can do to help. So following a reporting guideline is very important. So this is an example of CONSORT, which is the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, which helps you to remember all of the bits that need to go into a report. And I often ask my PhD students and master's students to use this when writing their dissertations. It just gives you the structure. This is an online version. The next one is for systematic reviews, to make sure that everything has been included and reported in the systematic review so it can be understood by the reader. Now, sometimes we get complaints when we have had experience of submitting papers to journals and people saying, well, it's not appropriate. You're using a PRISMA checklist, which was designed by healthcare trialists and synthesists, or CONSORT was the same, came out of healthcare. Now, we argue that the principles of good research are similar across domains, and that there's no reason why the principles of good science shouldn't apply equally from healthcare into other domains. But nonetheless, it helps to have things which are specific to our field. So the next slide, please, Talia. you can see here that the reporting guidelines have started to be developed for our fields in particular. And so language learning has guidelines for reporting quantitative methods results in primary research, which they ask people to adhere to when submitting those kinds of studies for publication. TESOL has a whole suite of different reporting guidelines for different types of research. And then language testing finally has just recently produced guidelines for reporting systematic reviews. And by adhering to these guidelines, we can be more confident that our research will not be wasted because it will be fully understood by the people who need to understand it.
Okay, so we're almost done. The second last slide here. Just to summarize, a few do's for reducing avoidable waste if you're a researcher in applied linguistics. As Hamish said, some elements of research waste are out of researchers' control, bureaucratic mechanisms, for example, that we fight against, but those are part of the systems that we can't immediately change unless we're in a position of power. But some things that we can do include embedding stakeholders' views and engagement into all elements of the research process, from the inception of the study through to dissemination. So Hamish gave the example of the priority setting exercise involving different educational stakeholders in actually deciding what should be researched in the first place, and then also in the co-production of research. And we really feel that leaving engagement, for example, with teachers as a major stakeholder to dissemination is too late. We need to involve teachers in actually setting the agenda for what should be researched, and then engaging with them throughout that process. We need to take stock of what has been done before embarking on a new study. So if you're doing any new study, it's just good practice to do a comprehensive review of the literature and make sure that you're not duplicating things that have already been done. So you want to avoid duplication. Robust replication is good, but you don't want to duplicate efforts. Producing and registering a research protocol or a plan for your research before you undertake that is really important for confirmatory studies. That prevents cherry picking results, and can be a way of just ensuring that you deliver what you say you will deliver when you plan the study. You should use appropriate methods to address the research problem and questions that you want to address. Again, these are fairly straightforward and intuitive, and I think that one is quite universal. You want to engage, as Hamish had just said, in robust and comprehensive research reporting. And that's really important because if primary studies have patchy information, then they can't be synthesized or replicated very well. And then just in general, to embrace open science principles. Some of what we've talked about, a lot of what we've talked about, interfaces well with open science, and also obviously adhering to ethical conduct in research practice. So last slide. We actually struggled to get this paper published. We got quite a bit of negative comments from reviewers who very much wanted a feel-good message. I think that they felt somewhat threatened that, like, we were putting healthcare research on a pedestal and kind of trying to bash applied linguistics research. And that was never our intention. Our intention was simply to draw on, another insights from another field where research waste has been identified as a persistent problem, and there's still papers coming out on research waste in healthcare research, but to learn from good practice and as well to highlight good practice in applied linguistics, because we think that there is room for improvement in terms of promoting research efficiency. So we're pleased the article's out and we get to disseminate in this forum. Again, I think the key message here is we hope that there are some insights here that are useful for applied linguists to improve the overall quality in research conduct and dissemination. Thank you, and I think we've gone over time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamish and Talia, for the wonderful presentation. I enjoyed listening to you, really, and I learned a lot from this presentation. There's so much food for thought here. I have read your papers, but when I listened to you, actually, I got new ideas about how you had started thinking about this research, and I learned a little bit about the processes that we don't usually see in the published paper, what is, under the hood, and how you conceptualize the study and what problems you probably encountered and all that.
Yeah, but some of it didn't make it into the paper because we had to take it out because of to appease reviewers.
All right.
So some of these points were in previous drafts, but yeah, we were happy that we got to share it with you today.
Okay, wonderful, nice. So I have asked our audience to ask questions. I mean, everyone, I just want to repeat my request. If you have any questions, please type it in the chat box. I'm very happy to read them out. I mean, I've got the first question, I guess, is from Taichi. Thank you for such an informative presentation. I'm wondering if we can quantify research waste in applied linguistics. Even if someone does this, I guess it will be very difficult to interpret the results. It would be great if you could share your thoughts on that.
Hamish, go for it.
Yeah, so it's a good point, and we're often quite keen to quantify, aren't we, so get an idea about what the extent of research waste is. So one of the things that we can do is to look to see how many. Well, I'll give you an example. A paper that I recently published, which looked at the systematic reviews on IDESA, so the collection of systematic reviews that we had there, and we audited them to see how well they had been reported. So to see whether the systematic reviews had been reported in line with Prisma, that is, that they were transparent and completely reported. And so we were able to quantify from that body of research how much, in essence, waste was being produced here because of systematic reviews which weren't completely reported and therefore weren't as useful as they ought to be. And it was quite depressing, to be fair. We found quite a lot of incompletely or poorly reported systematic reviews. Again, you can do the same within a systematic review in terms of reporting quality by looking at the primary studies that are eligible for synthesis and to see how well reported they are. And as I think Talia mentioned in one of her slides, this has been done for healthcare, where they've looked to see whether and to what extent primary research has been completely reported. And so just as one example of a way to sort of quantify the extent of research waste is to look and to see how well reported papers are, and arguably you could say if they're not well reported, then they're wasteful. And so that would be one way of doing it. The other thing it might be to look at the way that dissemination has happened from, the publication bias issue, is that how much research has been done, which has then not been published. And that, again, is quite difficult because you're trying to find things, in essence, which are hidden. But Angela de Bruyne's two studies that she did on the bilingual so-called advantage, where she looked to see whether, she looked at conference abstracts and then followed up to see how many of those conference abstracts had been published, and to look to see whether the findings or the interim findings of those things that were presented at conferences were associated with the publication. And as Talia showed you, 2/3 of publications which sort of adhered to the orthodoxy around a bilingual advantage were published, but only 1/3 of those which went against the orthodoxy were eventually published. And so this is wasteful because it's like flipping a coin, not showing people that, when it comes down on a tail and telling them that it's a head. It doesn't give you the full picture, so we don't have a full understanding of the sort of extent of our knowledge at any given point. So those would be two ways that you could try to quantify this.
I just add that sometimes they attach, and in, for example, healthcare research or ecology, work that's been done on this in ecology, they attach this to sort of looking at funding as well. And so you have huge funded projects that aren't effectively disseminated, and that results in sort of a US dollar figure of the annual amount of waste. So there are ways of doing that. Obviously, in applied linguistics, you wouldn't get those same kinds of figures because it's we don't get the same kinds of funding, and our studies tend to not we do a lot of unfunded research, and we don't have the same kind of funding as you would for a huge clinical trial, but still compelling to think about.
Very nice. All right, I have some questions here for you. When I was writing these questions, basically, I was reading a paper, so these questions crossed my mind, but you have already addressed them. Nevertheless, I believe these are some points that we can problematize further and have a discussion around them. One of them is about the first principle, which is about the principle of relevance. My understanding of the paper and a part of the presentation was that it's basically the stakeholder that can at least partly determine whether whether this research is going to be a wasteful research or not. So I think the stakeholder is defined here in the paper as mostly teachers. So maybe I misunderstood that. Please correct me if I misunderstood it. But my question is as follows. You know, in many fields, including medicine, specialized medicine, they do basic research. And basically, it lays the groundwork for applied research in the future. So my understanding is that it doesn't immediately have a stakeholder because it's not applied.
Yes.
How do we view this? I mean, what's your perspective on that? How do we view basic research in terms of the first principle, which is relevance?
Well, I would just back up, Hamish. I'll answer first, and then you can chip in. I would just back up and say, you know, we're talking mostly about applied research. We think that, you know, applied linguistics, you know, it's an applied field, but there are a broad range of sort of disciplines represented within applied linguistics. We're trying not to be prescriptive here, but certainly I think when you're trying to do research that has an impact beyond the academy, and there has been a lot of focus on that, then it is important to sort of try to get stakeholders steer as to what the focus should be. Sometimes we might be kind of in the ivory tower doing research that we think is meaningful for a stakeholder group, and actually they feel that that's irrelevant. So there's this disconnect that has been talked about in research on, you know, the research teaching nexus. So I think that also that point that you said, Vahid, about the definition of stakeholder is really important. Within a stakeholder group, there is not absolute consensus. They're not a monolith. And then if you introduce different stakeholders, teachers, parents, you know, head teachers, students, of course, they all have different views and perspectives as groups. So there will be differences in terms of what each of these groups consider and want to, you know, take stock of in terms of priorities. I mean, you know, in the field of language testing, one thing that has come to light is that, you know, test takers aren't usually consulted in terms of how, you know, tests are designed and how they're used and so on and so forth. But if you were to think about conceptualizing a study like that, I mean, the test taker community is very, very broad indeed. It would be difficult to sort of, I mean, I think that you wouldn't capture a single test taker's view, but there are methods like the one that Hamish used, which seek to establish some degree of consensus. So there are consensus building methods that, like in Hamish's priority setting exercise, involved a wide range of educational stakeholders and attempted to then come up with at least some kind of priorities that could be researched. And we're not saying that these must be done. There must be scope for researchers to, you know, conduct research that is driven by intellectual curiosity that may be detached from stakeholders, but certainly a lot of it should take that into account. And so we should be, you know, having sort of priority setting exercises in different fields within applied linguistics. Funders could be prioritizing those things in terms of what gets funded. Hamish, I'm sure you're dying to chip in.
Well, I think you covered the main points there. And it's we're not saying that no one should ever do blue skies research, no one should ever do basic research. That's really important. But again, as Talia said, that we are very much in the field of applied linguistics with the emphasis on applied, so that there's some perceived benefit to the application of our understanding of how, for example, languages are learned, and that in order to maximize the potential for our research, then we should be taking into account stakeholder views. And again, stakeholders can be defined differently and appropriately for different fields, for different types of research. And so when we did our priority setting partnership, we had parents, we had children, we had teachers. Similarly, when these things have been done in healthcare, they've had patients and caregivers and physicians. Rather than researchers. I mean, that's the people who are taken out, because we as researchers already have our voice. You know, as Talia alluded to, we can sit in our ivory tower and say, I think I'll do this. That's very interesting. And fair enough, it might be. And we know that an overly sort of prescriptive focus on impact, which is particularly common in the UK now, can be a little bit sort of restrictive, because you don't know what the impact of a piece of research might be until years later. You know, you see that with technology and so on. But it's our call is for a voice to be given to the stakeholders in applied research, because that application has got to be delivered by somebody. We're unlikely to be doing that ourselves. The application of our research is going to be done by other people, and so those people need to be brought into the process, and that there's definitely a space for that, and we think that it's probably not being maximized at the moment.
Very nice. Awesome. Thank you. If I may just follow up with one more questions, and then we will see if there are any further questions or not. It's about the second principle, and I read it out here. New research should not be done unless, at the time it's initiated, the questions it proposes to address cannot be answered satisfactorily with existing evidence. And of course, both of you talked about this. For example, you gave the example of phenological awareness in L1 and L2. In a sense, you suggested that it has actually been researched to death. So let's not waste too much resources that we have on this area, because we already know that there is a connection between them. And I think the summation of the average of correlations was 0.60, if I'm not wrong, from the paper, as far as I can recall. So let's problematize this principle a little bit more here. The question that I have here is, might this principle, in a sense, stifle innovative research that seeks to explore new perspectives or challenge existing paradigms? I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, no, that's a clear question. I mean, we can address that with an example. I just give you an example. Again, it didn't make it into the paper, but I was approached by, so there was a series on debates in educational linguistics or something like that. And they published a first edition. And you know that a lot of research that I do has been in the area of pronunciation, and pronunciation didn't make it into the first edition. It wasn't regarded, or they couldn't find somebody to author that chapter or that debate. But when the editors went to do a second edition of the book, they contacted me and said, can you write a chapter for us? It's based on the debate about whether we should instruct pronunciation in classrooms, you know, and, you know, is it beneficial or harmful, and that kind of thing. And I thought, gosh, we're stuck in a time warp with this. I mean, there have been systematic reviews on this topic that show that you need to have some kind of instructional focus on pronunciation. Learners don't just learn by osmosis. They need some kind of instruction on it, you know. And so I kind of went back to them and I said, I don't think this is the right debate topic. This might have been okay, you know, decades ago, but research has moved on. There's very good evidence now suggesting that, you know, so I think that, and so we, you know, the question, I think they found some good authors I declined, and, you know, they discussed, you know, what kind of teaching is more effective in pronunciation instruction, rather than should we, you know, teach it, yes or no. So I think it depends on the purpose, Vahid. Again, our intention isn't to be prescriptive, but in that kind of context where you're synthesizing an area of research and some kind of debate, you need to be current on what the debate is and what the relevant question is. You know, research has evolved. Otherwise, you are really stuck in a time warp. I think challenging the orthodoxy is something different, right? That if you want to poke holes in the methods that have been used because they haven't been very robust, and you know, that is absolutely fair game. So it doesn't mean that people can't revisit these questions, you know, if there are good reasons to do that. But I think that is an appropriate sort of for a state-of-the-art overview of a debate in a field. Yeah, Hamish, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the important thing you said there, Vahid, was innovation. So we're talking, we can use this to innovate rather than to invent. So we're not assuming that we're starting from scratch. That's I think that we see as the problem, is that somebody says, oh, I think I will go and investigate whether there's a correlation between L1 and L2 phonological awareness. That's inventing something that's already been done. Now, innovating on the understanding that we have already is something different. So now that we have this very good, and you're right, I'm just looking at the slide now, it's a 0.6 correlation between these two constructs. What does that mean? Where do we go from here? What's the next step along this research sort of journey? And again, and to sort of rewind a little bit, there's always a question of how, it's kind of like a how long is a piece of string question. You know, when are we satisfied that a question has been addressed? And that I think that probably people could probably make good arguments as to why this needs to be replicated or done in a different context or something. But you're not in a position to make that argument unless you have done a thorough job of looking at what we already know. And so that's again, it's the same principles. We shouldn't be stifling innovation. Certainly, people like to challenge the orthodoxy sometimes, but I would like to see that challenge being made on a solid foundation of what we already know, rather than just as of a less well-informed challenge or a less well-informed innovation, so that we're not wasting our resources and time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I like that answer. If you don't mind, can you take one more question, please?
Yes,
it's from Winke, and then Winke is asking, thank you for your insightful presentation. Could you share some of your personal experiences of research waste, and which of the 5 categories could it be classified? In hindsight, could anything have been done to avoid it? What lessons could be gleaned from the experience? Thank you. This is quite a challenging question. I mean,
yeah,
Winke asks very challenging questions always. So
that's good. I mean, I think that I have to return to my point about the quality of reporting. As a synthesist, as somebody who's done systematic reviews, it's massively frustrating to find studies which are not well enough reported to be able to make any conclusions. And so we often come to the conclusion that we can't tell. And so, and this also refers to study design as well. So one of my DPhil students has just published a systematic review on the use of songs and singing in early learning of a second language. And the quality of the, either the quality of the research in itself was poor, or let's say inappropriate for answering a causal question, even though they made causal implications and causal claims. Or if the design itself was not appropriate for answering those questions, then the reporting was not clear enough to understand. So people omitting very basic things like the number of people in the study, so we can get an estimate of the statistical precision, the outcome measures that we used, a clear definition of the intervention, so we can actually understand what has been done, a clear definition of the comparator, so that we can see what it was being compared with. And I think these are 2 really easy fixes for us as a research community, both from the perspective of writers of research, that we adhere to reporting guidelines so that we make sure that everything's included, and as editors of journals, where we can insist on clear and complete and transparent reporting, and so that at least on those 2 points of the research waste taxonomy, we're doing the best we can to make sure that, even if it's not been informed by stakeholders, even if it's had gone through bureaucratic inefficiencies, the actual end result is still something which is useful and therefore not wasteful.
Yeah, and I would add to that, from the perspective of a journal editor, that we often internally reject papers that aren't complete in their reporting. Method sections, we look at that carefully, and I think that your point is really important, Hamish, and journal editors do, I think, screen for sort of incomplete reporting, but formalizing that by requiring adherence to some kind of there are a few now available in applied linguistics, not only for quantitative studies, but also qualitative studies and mixed method studies. So we're talking about all studies across research paradigms, and primary studies and secondary studies all need to be well reported comprehensively. I mean, as much as you can do given the length of the article, but in sufficient detail so that they can be replicated or synthesized. Crucial. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And the last question, since I don't see any other questions there, my own last question here is about the most challenging principle to establish among the 5 principles. I'm asking this because many of our audiences here are PhD students or researchers who have just embarked on their research careers, or in the future, if someone watches the video, they would be interested to know which one of these principles, in your opinion, is the most challenging to establish. Can I have your perspective on that?
I'll change the word establish, but I'm going to just say which one is the most frustrating. I think that it's category 3, which has to do with the bureaucratic mechanisms, because those can be out of researchers' control. For example, you might want to do a simple study, very low risk. You report everything diligently in your ethics form, and then you end up not being able to undertake the study. This has happened to me just because of bureaucratic machine that effectively is well intentioned, but ultimately stymies research progress. And it can be. I think it's the problem arises when it's not commensurate with risk. Obviously, if you've got a high risk invasive study, with side effects for medical treatment, that standard, I think of risk assessment and so on and so forth is a lot higher than if you're doing a routine study where you're speaking to people. Obviously, you need to do due diligence, but you shouldn't be applying those same processes for the lower risk study. So, in my mind, I think that's the most frustrating for researchers because we're often powerless. We need to work within the systems to the best of our ability, but it can be a bit Kafkaesque. Sometimes out of our control, but there is a lot. I think all of those other waste categories are in our control, and as researchers, we can do something about that. So yeah, that would be my answer. But Hamish, you probably have a different answer.
I think that all of them are, with the exception of that, are fairly within the control of the researcher, and they're not difficult either. They're just conceptually sort of new for many people, and so there's no reason why these shouldn't be done. And you mentioned PhD students there. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we encourage, or I certainly encourage with my PhD students, is to do systematic review as part of the thesis. Not only does that mean that they get good understanding of the quality of evidence out there, and sometimes they see how badly reported it is, and so they do a better job, but it also gives them a very good warrant for their own primary research. This notion that a PhD ought to be offering something new. Well, if you've done a good quality systematic review and then based your primary research off that systematic review, you're in a very strong position to argue that you are contributing to our body of knowledge. The frustrating part that I find is through the publication and dissemination, and that's where we sometimes face ideological pushback from peer reviewers. And I think that I would like to think that I would recognize a good, well-conducted piece of research, even if I disagree with its findings or even its framing. But often we get pushback, and this paper was a good example, but others where people have said that you're taking a deficit view of language learning, for example, where I've just been doing a study which is trying to help children learn English. There are ideological and philosophical positions which disagree with me, and that's fine. But to be denied the opportunity to publish a good piece of research based on an ideological position of the editor or more commonly the reviewers is extremely frustrating. And so the whole peer review process, I think we know that the peer review process has got work to do to be improved just in general. And I would like to take some of the heat out of the argument and put in a little bit more light.
Fantastic. I identify with those issues that you actually highlighted. Just wanted to add my perspective on I want to pivot to the point that Talia mentioned about the regulations, and I mean the frustration that all of us have felt with research regulations and management processes, especially IRB. For example, IRB at our institute is very rigorous, which is good, but also it could be frustrating at times. I was reading a research paper recently, or maybe it was an article, which was comparing the productivity in industry, in AI industry, across the productivity of AI industry and productivity of academia in terms of producing AI systems. And one of the interesting findings was that the companies or industries that are involved in AI are much more productive than academia. One reason that the author had mentioned was that there's so much regulation, so much rules, regularization, and things like that, that basically dampen productivity in academia, especially in certain fields of research, which interestingly do not exist in the same rigorous way in industry, the way that we face them here in academia. I mean, this will be something to look into in the future, and I hope some recommendations can be made. Any final remarks?
I just add, just to say that this year we had some students who wanted to do research on young learners, and they'd done really good sort of conceptual plans of their dissertations, and weren't ultimately able to do that because of some of these bureaucratic mechanisms. So instead, they had to switch to researching undergraduate students, in their program, which massively over-researched group. So I think that was a real tragedy. You can see that even if you kind of do all of these things that you need to do as a researcher to try to avoid waste, sometimes you just can't get beyond that, and that forces you then to reconceptualize, regroup, and then maybe produce something that would be less novel, duplicating efforts and so on and so forth. So, I mean, for me, that's a huge frustration, and we couldn't get around it. But I think it's important to just kind of do follow these principles. They're good practice principles. They will result in sort of probably higher quality research conduct, and then also dissemination. Your potential for getting your work published in a good venue is much higher if you follow these principles. If you make sure that there's a study out there that you haven't looked at, and your references are all out of date, you're probably not going to get that published in a good journal. You need to do your homework, make sure you go to IDESR and check all the, systematic reviews out there, make sure you do a thorough check for all the primary research, nail that. And then if you follow these general, I think they're not that opaque. A lot of these principles are just basic, good, how to conduct research in a robust way. They're basic, general, common sense principles. So if we want to kind of demystify that, we've kind of presented it as part of a fancy, framework here. But at the base of it, I think if you just follow these principles, you'll end up doing a better study that is less wasteful, that actually contributes something to knowledge in some way, including through synthesis or replication potentially, which is also valuable. And then you go and get it published in a really good venue, and and then that in turn leads to more research and innovation, and really drives change in our field. I think that's why we do research. That should be what drives us, I think. So yeah, that's it for me.
Fantastic. And Hamish, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I mean, I'm just referring to this idea that as teachers we can do whatever we like in the classroom with nobody checking. If as researchers we want to do a careful study which helps us to learn about something, we have to jump through hoops. And so there's this, to paraphrase a GP who said, given our links with healthcare here, is that I can do whatever I want to do in my classroom unless I undertake to learn from it. And what I mean by undertake from learn from it is do it in a way which would allow us to find out, or I can give a treatment or a learning intervention to all of my children with no problem. But if I want to give it to just half of them, then I have to go through all of these bureaucratic inefficiencies to do that, i.e. half of them as a control group versus an experimental group. And so there are this sort of these weird double standards that are being applied that somehow, when I was a classroom teacher, I'd walk through into my classroom, close the door, and as far as anyone else was concerned, I was free to do exactly what I pleased. But then when we want to try and find out whether, giving children these kinds of books to read, comparing to those kinds of books to read, then suddenly that becomes a big problem, and there are ethical issues around that, whereas there are not ethical issues in me just deciding what book I'm going to use tomorrow morning when I walk into the classroom. Same way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's really thought provocative too. It sounds like a huge controversy surrounding research versus pedagogy and practice. Thank you so much, Hamish and Talia. This has been a wonderful day, and I really enjoyed listening to you. I learned a lot, as I mentioned before. I hope that we can do this in the future when you have more research and you would like to share with us, either as a part of the interface or other venues. Thank you again so much for your participation and your wonderful presentation, and thanks to everyone. Thanks to Sabrina and Lynette who helped us with the administration process. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, this seminar. I'd like to say goodbye to all of you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, Vahid.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.